Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are. Mary Hunt here at the Water Office. I am absolutely delighted to be here with Diane New and with Lisa Johnson, and we are very happy to have you join us for our October 5th, 2021 tea. And we will be looking today at industrial schools, the complexity of the Irish problem with our friend Sheila Curran from Dublin. We are happy to give a special welcome to people for whom this is your first experience with us. You are especially welcome, and I see a couple of friends, including a very old and dear friend of mine who has joined us, so I'm happy to see each and every one of you. It's just a great opportunity to continue a very important discussion. This tea format is a hybrid that we developed due to COVID. We found that our monthly meditation program, which is very popular, and our monthly liturgy, which is always very meaningful, and our talk about academic subjects, the water talks, are really very important in and of themselves. But we also found the need for what Cheryl Nichols and I have talked about before is this kind of hybrid way to focus on topics of common interest and concern in a more personal and a more informal way. And so it seems to work, and I'm just delighted to have each and every one of you with us, and especially those for whom it's your first time with us. You are even more welcome than everyone else. We here in Silver Spring acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. Where water is located is the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and the Chungtank, sometimes known as the Costin people, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to making clear the names of these lands and the community members from those nations who reside alongside us. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country and recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has had a deep impact on Indigenous communities, communities of color, as well as immigrants and others. Therefore, water programs are aimed at supporting and igniting social change, whether in theology, ethics, or ritual. Water's efforts are geared to bring together solid intellectual data with the activist and spiritual commitments of our Alliance members. In accord with our commitment to anti-racism, we have this fall put a priority on learning about and acting to eradicate injustices that encircle it. Last week, colonialism in its many forms was something we began with as Marion Ronan provided a very instructive talk on settler colonialism, on the extinction of people, especially in the U.S. And we continue this month with Sheila Curran, who will focus on Ireland's industrial schools. I seek your guidance on other related topics and speakers, so please send them to me at mhunt@hers.com. And as always, if you've missed a session or you want to watch it again, you just go to our website, www.waterwomensalliance.org, and you can watch all of the programs that we have put on, whether it's a liturgy or it's a talk or a tea or a meditation. Those are all available for your use, and we encourage you to use them and to share them with other people. Lest you think that our topic today is obscure, this morning the French government released a long-awaited report on sexual abuse in Catholic institutions in France. Over the last 70 years, they reported more than 216,000 cases involving Catholic clergy, with the numbers swelling to 333,000 if lay teachers in Catholic schools and other institutions in France are included. This is thought to be the largest number reported by any country in the world, though I bet it is still the tip of an even larger iceberg. Notable findings in France include the systemic character of the cover-ups and the fact that, quote, the vast majority of victims were pre-adolescent boys from a wide variety of social backgrounds, unquote. Therefore, I think it's only timely that we are talking today with Sheila Curran about the industrial schools in Ireland. And our format is as follows. I will give a brief introduction to Sheila. She'll spend about 20-25 minutes with a PowerPoint that I think you'll find very helpful. We are able to share it with her gracious permission. And then we'll have a very short time, maybe about 10-12 minutes in small groups, to talk with each other and to resource one another on this topic and focus questions for discussion. We'll be looking again at the industrial schools in Ireland in a very complex situation. We'll finish up with a plenary question and answer time with Sheila, who doesn't pretend to be an expert on all of this, and we don't expect her to be, just someone who's opening conversation. We'll close officially at the top of the hour, 3 o'clock here on the East Coast, later as you go one way or earlier as you go the other, with a Zoom link that will stay open for conversation after we close the official session. The video of this session will be on our website at www.waterwomensalliance, along with notes. So don't worry if you've missed the terms or spellings or titles. We'll come up with notes. We'll take the notes. You drink the tea, and we'll run the notes by Sheila first to make sure we have communicated faithfully what she has been saying. But don't worry about getting every jot and tittle on your own notes. We will provide some notes that we hope will be helpful. So with that, let me introduce Sheila Curran, who is no stranger to water or to these teas. Welcome, my dear. Sheila is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of Mercy, the Northern Province in Ireland. She holds a doctorate of ministry and a master's in biblical studies from the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She has an MA in equality studies from the University College in Dublin and a degree in social work from the University of Ulster, Jordanstown in Belfast. She works with migrants and refugees in Dublin. This is after many decades, actually, in Latin America. Her theological research and writing on the themes Cry of Earth and Cry of the Poor reflect her feminist perspective. And so she brings a wide set of experiences to this, not only in the Irish situation, but also having lived here in the U.S. and particularly having lived for some time in Latin America. She'll look with us today at Irish industrial schools from pre- and post-independence Ireland, highlighting the complicated role of religion, particularly the Roman Catholic Church and its relationship to the state. She'll lay out the challenges emerging from research so that what is really happening with groups who are trying to do this work, and how are we in the advocacy groups helping and hindering a deeper analysis of the issues. These issues are not easy. I warn you that sometimes they can be triggering of experiences you may have had if you watched the television piece that Sheila shared with us, or if you read the article. You know that these are difficult issues, and please care for yourselves as you deal with them. We appreciate your work, Sheila, and we look forward to learning from and with you on a tough topic. We are in your capable hands, Sheila Curran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary, for the invitation, and thank you to everybody at Water. Yeah. And first and foremost, as I say, to say, number one, I am not an expert on this topic. It is a very emotive topic. It has many layers, and there are other layers in Ireland, whether it's mother and baby homes, and other situations of this complexity. I am a Sister of Mercy, therefore I am a member of one of the congregations that's highly involved in this issue, and has been, as you will see, one of the congregations involved for both in running industrial schools and in the aftermath of that. So what I want to share with you, what I would say are what I call very broad strokes and something of a wider context about the island of Ireland that maybe for some of you may not be familiar. So firstly, to say that, Ireland was a country that was occupied by Great Britain, and therefore the whole idea of Catholicism and our background in Catholicism was that it was a religion that was oppressed for very many years in my country. And the Church of Ireland would have remained the official church for nearly 300 years. And it was only after Catholic emancipation or just before it that the expression of Catholic faith as a faith had freedom to be expressed in the country. And that's one of the big backdrops, in a country like Ireland. And that it was only in the 1831 when a system of education became established, primary education became established in the country. So as I say, all of these are big, long topics. None of them are going to be covered in full in this presentation, but just so that you know. Let's see, how can I change? And the other thing was that Ireland was marked by a famine, and any of you that have Irish ancestors in North America at all would can link to some of these themes. It was one of the greatest upheavals in the country, and over 1 million people perished, 1 million people emigrated. But the amount of destitute children and orphaned or children that were deserted by their families or their parents because they couldn't care for them, either chose emigration and left their children behind, left huge destitute children in the country of Ireland. So there were also people who went to prison for simple things like stealing a cabbage, and therefore people could have ended up in prison. Their children could have wandered around, nobody to look for them. So, I mean, this is one of the big things that there was a flourishment of poverty, a flourishment of destitution in the country. And things such as workhouses were created, but workhouses were the last resort for anybody to go to. They were such harsh regimes, and there was no special provision for children in workhouses. So that then began to see a growth in what we would see was voluntary agencies. And of course, there were always caring philanthropy people. There were always people looking to care for these destitute children. And this was the beginning of a creation of what you would say are orphanages and the beginning of a type of an industrial school. At the same time, the Catholic Church, which would have been a very different shape post-famine, was more influenced by one archbishop in particular, and there's an awful lot written on this person and how the Catholic Church became a more homogenized, centralized church in the island of Ireland. His name was Paul Cullen, a very influential figure in the history of Ireland. And he was also very much concerned by destitution and poverty and what would happen to children who were orphaned and how could he and the Catholic Church help and support them. At the same time, there would have been the foundation of my own congregation, which is the Sisters of Mercy, the Irish Sisters of Charity, the Christian Brothers, and the French Sisters of Charity, who began to grow in the country at that time, and who also saw their option to provide services for the poor and needy. Then there became a much more constructed idea, which was this thing of an industrial school. And of course, the ideological ideas of this were based in an ideological construct of utilitarianism, which was gaining ground in the 19th century with ideas from people like Locke, James Mills, and people like that. And also that religious orders were growing in numbers. They also had time and commitment and personnel that began to be able to give service in these kind of schools and look for the care and education of children. It was quite amazing to see the growth of Catholic schools who became both managed and partially staffed by both sisters and convents, especially those that were run for girls. And of course, these schools were established on a plot of land that were either given by, in our case, usually by the diocese, where there were other schools and other services taking place as well. They would have had additional paid staff. Boys in these kind of schools were catered for mainly by brothers, either the presentation of the Christian Brothers. They said that mostly the Christian Brothers would have charged for their services, but they used to invest them back in the schools, while a lot of the sisters didn't charge for their services per se, but had money from the state to help pay for their staffing. Once, as I said, prior to this, most of this was built on the British system, and the British system was influenced by what was happening in Europe. But Ireland only got its independence from Britain and became a republic around 1922. And it's interesting to note in its first democratic programme, it says the following: "It shall be the first duty of the government of the Republic of Ireland to make provision for the physical, mental, and spiritual well-being of children, to secure that no child shall go hungry or cold from the lack of food, clothing, or shelter, as future citizens of an independent Irish state." And that was quite a visionary statement, quite a lauded statement. But the sad tragedy is that when Ireland formed its constitution, there was no reference to the aid for needy parents or to provide for children in the constitution to the same extent as was expressed in the first democratic programme for government. Rather, the state saw more its role to strip unfit parents of their parental rights. And while the state did introduce some kind of small payment, for parents and children, it was initially a small stipend for the second child that a family would have and more, not when they only had one child. The exclusion of children from the Irish Constitution was a disgraceful abandonment, and it was not until 2015, which is a long way off from when we established the state, that the rights of children became more enshrined in our Constitution. Today, there is payment given to more than one child, of course, and children's allowance is has a lot more money attached to it, but still not sufficient for a lot of families. And indeed, for the aid of children is something that I'll talk about later. But the industrial school system continued and was the responsibility of the state, established by law and regulated and funded by the Department of Education once there was the foundation of the Irish state. The Catholic Church sought to ensure that the Irish social policy was imbued with Catholic principles, and this has always been a bone of contention. Again, there was a very influential Archbishop by the name of John Charles McQuaid, who was very influential to the first president of this country, or for the first head of government of this country, called Eamon de Valera. And in the writing of the Constitution, which historians will show very clearly that his influence was he had such a big influence in the drafting of the Irish Constitution. Therefore, this tension, and it's a bone of contention today, that the influence of the Catholic Church in a pluralist society, that some of the wording of the Constitution is always up for grabs. But one of the things that McQuaid began to say was also that to secure the future of children, and especially against the Protestant faith, was to ensure that these schools were still in the hands of the like of the Sisters of Mercy, who catered for 90% of girls in industrial schools. The Christian Brothers, one of the other big, larger congregation which catered for boys. And in total, there would have been 18 religious congregations which were involved in religious industrial schools in Ireland. So the industrial school system became very deeply rooted and durable within this country for a very, very long time. It was a form, of course, its ideals were in somewhat quite laudable, because it was to give an education, but also to give a skill set so that children could get a trade, whether that was in like being a cobbler, being a carpenter, being an engineer, being somebody who could sew. It was that education literacy wasn't sufficient in order to equip children with other skills so that they could be employable. So in terms of what they were set out to do, would have sounded quite good. But unfortunately, due to the way that they were constructed and due to the very high numbers of children who were in these schools, corporal punishment was very much a reality. It was highly abusive and very punitive culture. There was also sexual abuse in the hands of either parents, family members, religious, friends, or workers within these schools. There was also collusion, people who knew that it took place but kept quiet, or people who tried to do something and didn't know where to go at that time or how to make their voices heard, and then were told to keep quiet. The whole system was an institutionalized system. It wasn't given credence to any one need, any shortcomings in any children's learning ability. It was not personalized in any way. They were a depersonalized system. As I said, most of these were very large numbers of children were in these, the use of numbers and not their name, or they were called by maybe the color of their hair or some derogatory term. And of course, another issue was the way that the church dealt with illegitimacy, because to be born outside of wedlock in Ireland was seen to be nearly a crime. So some people, what could they do with children? Very often, if they didn't want to keep their children, was either put them into orphanages or were forced to put them into orphanages, which you would have heard from the mother and baby home scandals. So the way in which the church and still deals with illegitimacy to some extent can be seen in the backdrop of all of this. A lot of staff did not have training, though there would have been staff who had a lot of caring. Not everybody was the same. You cannot tar every person that worked in these schools with the same brush, but unfortunately, there is a blanket statement to view about how people treated people in these schools. While some of the regimes were harsh, some people were not as harsh as others, and some people were actually very good and caring. Most of these schools in the image that was sent out, you will see, were either very big institutionalized places, walled, where there was a removal from people from society. Very often children in industrial schools were separated from children in regular schools. Consent, there was a debate whether parents consented to their children being in these places. Some people did not consent to their child being kept in these places. Some of these children would have been sent because they were seen with petty crime, and this was the way to deal with them. Some of them were there, as I said, because their parents abandoned them, or because their parents were dead, or for whatever reason. But there is a whole issue around the adoption of children in this country and the lack of access that people have to their information. And of course, there was secrecy of adoption of children to the United States. In Ireland, training for childcare was only established in 1971. So prior to that, there was no academic training for people that worked in childcare, unless they had gone abroad. But very often people were not equipped to deal with some of the complexity of problems that they met with children in their care. The Department of Health only took over the care of children in 1984. So most of it was either under the Department of Justice or under the Department of Education. And it was only when the Department of Health took over the care of children that children were offered fostering as an option and not put into some of these places. But the abuse of children, as you know, still continues today in all its horrendous forms and in different ways. Maybe not so much that you can point to an industrial school, but you're going to point to it very much even children in foster care or children who are still in care today. So training doesn't necessarily mean that abuse stops. One of the big issues in Ireland, of course, is that there is a flawed 20th century history, way in which we look at history in the country. And it's very nuanced and very subjective and depending on how people research it. There is an absence of any clear discussion in the complexity of family and childhood. And most of the stories become manipulated from one lens or another. One of the lack of analysis, of course, is the level of inequality and poverty that still afflicts a lot of families and children today. And most of the people who were abused and most of the people who ended up in industrial schools came from what we call the lower classes of society. It's not totally that, but it is huge numbers would reflect the huge inequality in the country. And there continues to be huge inequality into how children are dealt with, depending on what social class they come from. But one of the groundbreaking challenges in Ireland was this film called Dear Daughter, which was a watershed moment. And I sent you maybe something on that. It was the story of one person by the name of Christine Buckley, and she was in an orphanage in Golden Bridge in Dublin, which was run by the Sisters of Mercy. And she talks about the abuse at the hands of a particular sister by the name of Sister Severia. That story is a very inflammatory story, and I'm not denying that abuse or that violence to children did not take place in the hands or care of any of the places belonging to the Sisters of Mercy. But the way in which this drama unfolds and the reconstruction by actors and the memories that are evoked by Miss Buckley were never challenged, nor any alternative ever given. This was a film that received very wide-ranging coverage and very uncritical reviews. And while it alighted some of the horrible issues that went on in industrial schools, it didn't lead to a very nuanced or more academic or more critical look at all of that system. But it did lead to the historical inquiry into child abuse in 1999, which initially was called the Lafoy Commission, and later, because Mary Lafoy resigned as chair of that commission in 2003, over claims that the Irish Department of Education, which was in charge of inspecting the orphanages and industrial schools, refused to hand over documents to her. So that is one of the bones of contention, is that the state doesn't hand over the same access to its papers as that the religious congregations do today. So there is part of the story told and part of the story remains untold. There's huge criticism of all of this system and it's multi-layered. But the Ryan report focuses mostly on the blame for the decades of terror of boys and girls in the Irish Republic, mainly on the Catholic priests and nuns that were in charge of these industrial schools. Some blame does go on to the government inspectors who failed to stop the beatings or the rape or the chronic humiliation that did take place. There is criticism, of course, of the church and state partnership that made choices for reasons of expediency. Religious orders are generally blamed for being the cheapest model of care available, and that they were only into being money-making rackets and gained huge amounts of money from these industrial schools or Magdalen laundries or whatever. And that religious harbored criminals among them and did very little to expose criminal behavior such as sexual abuse. People would claim that the religious orders are still not held fully accountable for their deed. And while the subject remains completely emotive, apologies were not fully accepted. Even though both states and religious orders, individually and collective, have made different apologies at different times, and money and redress have been an issue, it doesn't take away from the pain and the suffering, and still hasn't brought any kind of closure to some of the opening wounds that still lie beneath the very myriad threads of this very complex issue. There has been apology from the state, as I say. There has been apologies from all of the religious orders involved. There has been attempts by some to have a more balanced account, but it always comes back that it becomes from the lens of the person that's doing it. In other words, if religious orders employed somebody to do an account of what might be there, they're accused of trying to put their case of no blame forward, while that is not the case. Because not all religious beat children, not all religious sexually abused children, not all religious were violent towards children, but there is a blanket image, and always the image of a nun, particularly used in very derogatory formats in Ireland at various times to depict how we are even today. The money and redress schemes has constantly been debated, that where it is said that the religious still have not paid their full amounts, and it depends on who has access to what accounting, that blames certain orders for not fulfilling their requirements. A lot of orders have. A lot of the redress and money at the time that was given, or the property that was given in the accounting of the time. But often what comes out is that the religious still owe a lot of money for this and should pay a lot more redress money, or a lot more money. It has to be said that lawyers and accountants have made an awful lot of money out of this issue, because, as they always say in Peru, one person's poverty is another person's gain. There has been a funding of an independent phone line and helpline and counselling by various religious orders to help the victims of abuse in Ireland. There has been an attempt by some religious congregations towards what we call restorative justice and healing. The majority of religious have opened their files to the public to investigate accusations or to find information about their time in any of these places. But all religious congregation members are still tainted and held accountable today for the past members' actions. I don't know if a family would be held to the same account for the actions of their members that might have accused or done a violent act as the way religious congregation members are today accused and held accountable as a collective today for actions that we may not have been involved or committed as individual members ourselves. As I said, it's a really, really challenging area to look at the commissioning of research. And academics are reluctant to take on the issue because it's a very contentious issue. They may do some small pieces, but it's still very difficult to get a full, clear picture of the multiple layers that are involved in these issues. Usually sensationalizing headlines, one or two people's experiences become the norm, and that's what is released. But as I say, we are still, maybe it's too soon to get really a decent amount of research in this, but it is really interesting to note, and I will show two people's work and the difference where the truth probably remains somewhere in between these. Advocacy groups, while they remain trying to focus the issue on the abuses and the degradation that may have happened in the past. It's very interesting to note that some of these issues still pertain to childcare today in Ireland. And while they can be very inflammatory, we still in Ireland have not looked at the deepest issues of what is happening within both family and childcare that still results in children, in the rights of children being violated, the lack of resourcing being put into good, decent childcare, or to people with disabilities, or to people who suffer racial, sexual, or whatever kind of abuse today. The problems have not gone away, despite the fact that a lot of these issues remain focused in the past. They still are present today. Maybe not in the huge numbers of children that were in the past, like in the past in orphanages and big institutions, but they still happen. Children are abused in care, they're abused in foster homes, they are abused in families, they're abused by people that so-called say they love and care for them. It hasn't gone away. Childcare facilities, as I say, are still an issue of contention and still under force or completely under-resourced in this country. But as I said, the two big documentaries that shed light on this issue in Ireland, but are highly contentious, is a documentary called States of Fear, which I sent you the link of. Dear Daughter is not open access, which was the one that I referred to earlier. There are some books written, but as I said, not a lot, but two of the kind of different ways of looking at the story is one by that was done by the woman who started States of Fear, Mary Raftery, and that exposed this thing called Dear Daughter. It's called Suffer Little Children, the inside story of Ireland's industrial schools. It would generally lay the blame 100% at the door of the religious and the Catholic Church in Ireland for the problem, by and large. And then there's this other interesting work by a woman by the name of Moira Maguire, who did Precarious Childhood in Post-Independence Ireland. And her work is slightly more nuanced and brings out some of the contradictory evidence in some of the research that she has done. As I say, somewhere between the blame being 100% with the religious, partly with the state, partly with families, partly with children, partly with whoever. Somewhere the total truth has still not been revealed, and it is an ongoing sore that brings many layers and complexity as we continue to look at this being exposed in different ways across our world and in different times. But I suppose two of the big issues is, how did we become people where that God's love for everybody and the universality of God's love became something that became a more vindictive type of nature, idea of a God that was a judge, a God that was fearful, a religious theology that was so oppressive? How did it take such a firm grip? How was it the one that really became the one that was known in Ireland more than anything else? A God of, admonishment, a God, not a God of love. And why did religious become guardians of the state, that they institutionalized and kept children in a prison-like system? What happened to that en masse, that charisms that were founded, like mine, to be an option for the poor, became tainted by becoming a guardian of the state? And I suppose there are deeper issues that we need to look at into the future. Thank you for your attention. It's very broad strokes. As I say, I am not an expert. I just wanted to highlight some of the complexities that the issue poses in my country, with a lot more work that needs to be done on the issue. Thank you.
Sheila Curran, thank you so much. We are in your debt for this presentation, and people can find the PowerPoint at www.waterwomensalliance.org. Look under programs and look under Teas, and October 5th, and you will find in a couple of days when we get this up, you will find both the PowerPoint and also Sheila's presentation. Sheila, I thank you so much for such a candid look at this. I think, it's hard to say who has a balanced view of it, but you certainly have offered us much nuance, and I really appreciate that so very much, and look forward to our continued conversation about this. It's not an easy topic, and it's not a topic confined to Ireland. And so I think with those two things in mind, we move into our small groups to have conversation. What are some of the ways in which what Sheila has presented vis-a-vis the Irish situation, what are some of the ways in which similar dynamics are playing out where you are, whether you're in the US or in Canada or other parts of the world. What are, and even in different parts of the US, what are some of the nuances of this that are playing out where you are? Likewise in Canada, certainly in the western part of Canada. Veronica, I know where you are, is one of the places where many of the schools in Canada are. So I'm now going to ask Lisa to kindly put us into small groups. Let us open the floor for conversation with another round of thanks for Sheila Curran's excellent presentation. We all agreed that it was a marvelous way of getting us started, and we're in your debt, Sheila. So the floor is open, and please state your name and even where you were.
I just wanted to point out, I've done a lot of work with survivors during my career, and was president of, well, I was a media spokesperson during the United States crisis on this issue, and dealt with a lot of people overseas. And recently, before the pandemic, one of the women who had been appointed as a layperson to the Vatican's Commission on Child Abuse, I believe she was from Ireland, and she resigned her position because even after talking to the Pope, basically, she said they wouldn't give us a budget. Something so simple. How could they deal with this? They never had money to do what they needed to do, to meet, to do anything meaningful. And in return, the church in Ireland was putting out all this stuff about her, how disturbed she was and things like that, to try to trash her reputation, to affect her credibility. And that's kind of a standard operating procedure, no matter where this happens. And this is why advocacy keeps doing, the advocates are doing what they're doing, because they need to get people to listen. I mean, if the state won't release its records, you need the advocates to keep pushing for it. And I can't talk about Ireland, but in our country, I attribute the truth coming out because of the lawyers and their civil suits. And I know a lot of these people, and they are just the best people in the world. I've never been prouder to be a lawyer than when I've been with them. And the journalist who dug this stuff up. That's why the truth has come out here, and so many other countries are years behind where we are, at least in terms of exposing these things. So I just wanted to bring that out, because I have the utmost respect for the survivors who are advocating in the spite of overwhelming odds, and the church is not helping.
Thanks, Linda. And Sheila reminds us in the chat that woman's name is Marie Collins. Let me throw in a question here, Sheila, just it's kind of a thought question, and that is, and Linda, you can maybe take on this as well. Why is it that I have the impression, I could be very wrong, but I have the impression that things in Ireland have really, the impact of this on the Irish society has been enormous. And somehow here in the US, and part of it has to do with religious demographics and all of that, but somehow in the US, is it because we're so short-sighted, or we have such short memories, that it doesn't seem to have had the same impact here? I don't know if either one of you or both want to comment on that. Am I off base there? It just seems like that we've had horrible things here, and yet a lot of people are still quite uncritical of the church, whereas in Ireland, it seems to me that so many people are critical, and mass attendance is off dramatically, and France is ahead of the curve. Their mass attendance is under 5% prior to this report coming out. So I just wonder what's the matter with us here in the U.S. that people still are tolerant of this.
We have the separation of church and state, so that when it came out that the church was involved in this, the state was involved with it too. And so the government, my understanding is that a lot of the government people had to resign and so forth. You don't have that in the United States because we've got the separation of church and state. And so it's just a completely different way that things are organized, because we don't have a state religion. We don't, I mean, they'd like to control what the legislators do, but that's my understanding, is that fundamentally it was just a different way that the church and state had their relationship intertwined, so that when it fell fast.
Yeah, Sheila, do you have a comment on that? And then I think Maureen McGowan wants to make a comment.
I think that's true, that there's like, I mean, as I tried to highlight, like Catholicism in Ireland had a whole other flavor, you know, both because of our colonization and because of, you know, what people sacrificed in the past for their faith in a way in a country. It was also because we had huge numbers of religious in this country. And I mean huge numbers for a small island, both in terms of what we exported abroad, as well as, like when I joined the Sisters of Mercy in 1982, we were under 5,000 sisters in this country. And we were diocesan based at that time. We were 26 dioceses. Like, we did not have industrial schools in my diocese. We did not. We only became one congregation in 1994. So like, it's a huge shift. You know, you don't have near that number. We're just going under 2,000 Sisters of Mercy in Ireland. Our average age is 81. The whole landscape of Ireland has changed radically in terms of both its demographic and in terms of the place of faith in the culture and all of that as well. But nobody can get their head around the amount of religious that were in this country, and the whole fabric of the country, like in terms of the social services of the country. 90% of it was run by voluntary organizations because the state did not invest in education to the same extent, or indeed in social services. And it still doesn't. We are still very poor in the investment in those two areas. But the voluntary organizations, primarily religious run, were that, which would be very different to the US as well.
I thank you, Sheila, for your presentation. It was just wonderful. I would just add to what you said, that in Ireland, the difference is they also, the Catholic Church ran all the national schools. So everybody grew up being taught by nuns or priests, where in America that doesn't happen necessarily. So they had a huge influence. And also Archbishop McQuaid and the man before him, they were more powerful, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sheila, they had more power than the Taoiseach, President of Ireland. And they were very, very influential. So I just wanted to throw that out. So everybody, I have a family in Ireland, and every one of them have experiences with good and not so good, but a lot of good, growing up with nuns and priests and being taught by them, going to mass with them, you know, everything. So.
Thank you. Actually, I have a different perspective from India. I see the whole system in the church wrong. I feel the way we are taught our faith was wrong. The core of our faith is love, but we were never taught that. We were taught a God who is stern, who is a punishing God. Love was never made the core of our faith. And I wouldn't blame the nuns, because even today, nuns are in the structure and very much controlled in that structure. And I think even over then, they were very much controlled in that structure. I too am dealing with abuse issues in my church in India today. And I see how the structure keeps everything secret. And I see how they even are, you know, some of the religious who are my friends, I'm shocked how they are roped in by the bishop to reinforce the silence of the victims and to silence victims. So you see, the structure has to change. And I hope this forthcoming synod is going to make us all speak up and demand the change in the structure. This top-down structure, this patriarchal hierarchical structure that's rooted in empire, you know, it is rooted in empire, and empire is no longer relevant in the 21st century.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to invite you to stay with us, of course, and continue that conversation as we move into our informal discussion after we have a formal end to this one. And I want to thank Sheila Curran again for your insight and for your commitment to justice on all fronts, Sheila, as I know you. And I want to then encourage all of us who are in our different settings, and Virginia will want to hear more about the India situation from you in time. We want to hear from the Canadians. There's just so much to talk about here, and I think it fits, as you can see, in the continuing conversation that we began last month on colonialism. Now this look at the industrial schools and moving forward to see how these pieces fit into the kind of supremacist and colonialist structures in which we find ourselves. So I want to thank all of you for being with us. I want to point out how grateful we are for your participation. We welcome your support, of course, but as you know, we at Water believe that together, if we share, there is enough. And so those who can give do, and those who are not able to do so give in other ways, and all are equally welcome at Water programs without distinction. So that's been our approach for the last 37 years, and it has and continues to work in terms of our collective sharing. So thank you again to everyone, particular thanks to Sheila Curran and to Lisa Johnson for technical help. Feel free to stay on and chat, and a good day to those who have to leave, and good health to all. Thanks again from Water.